we're going to get started here. It's 5 o'clock. Welcome to the Spokane .NET User Group. People, I'm sure, will keep filtering in. While everyone's waiting, there's coffee, the fresh pot that was brewed, so you can grab that if you want some. Some other logistical things. The bathrooms are right around the corner, so feel free if you want to. I'm not forcing you to, but you can go. But tonight we're going to be get inspired by .NET Aspire. But before that, we have a couple of announcements and other kind of managerial things. So today's meetup is sponsored by Intelitech. That's where you're here today, obviously. And just a little blurb about them. And obviously, I'm part of Intelitech. So they're leaders in the solution architecture and software design world. Intelitech provides high-end architecture, consulting, full lifecycle software development, and training that enables their clients to solve their most challenging problems. They're also passionate about learning and serving the community. The Intelitech team help run multiple local meetups like this one and teach C# at Washington University. We also are very passionate, and it extends beyond the classroom. If you're interested in any of that, attend the website. There's a lot more information there. Some of the announcements for the .NET User Group specifically. This is kind of the relaunch of the .NET User Group here, sponsored by Intelitech. So we wanted to have some feedback and some initial questions for you guys. First off, the .NET User Group is monthly at the end of the month, so the last Tuesday of each month. But that is kind of based on your guys' opinions and also what the speaker's availability is. So if you have feedback or thoughts on that, the QR code on the left will be a form for just like what kind of topics you guys hear about, when works best for you to attend, and invite your friends and kind of things like that. Another thing, on the right side, if people do want to present or have a cool idea that they would be interested in, the right QR code is more information and kind of sends me a thing of, hey, I would be interested in presenting. Otherwise, our next meetup group will be currently at the end of May, so that's May 28th. And it's going to be around the big hot button issue right now, and that's AI, and then applicability to. So that'll be a really cool one. Make sure to attend. And now we'll go out and meet up, and we'll have the same cadence as well. Some other announcements are there's lots of other really cool user groups that Intelitech sponsors or just others in the Spokane community. So the Python user group, Joe in the back, he runs that. And that's the next meetup is May 21st at 6 p.m. There's other events. Go to meetup, go to that one. The DevOps user group, which Phil runs right there, that's more of a lunch style. And the next one is scheduled for May 28th, 12 p.m. And then there's the Rust user group, which Joshua runs. And that one is, the next one scheduled is May 9th at 6 p.m. And then there's also the Go user group. And that's not currently scheduled for the next one, but they have been meeting on a regular cadence. So just go out to meet up. There's lots of other groups that are really good and highly recommend them. But without further ado and more announcements, Joshua, please take away with getting inspired by .NET Aspire.
All right. Thank you for the intro. Sweet. All right, so I'm here to talk to you guys about .NET Aspire, which is a streamlined approach to cloud-native development. First, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm a software engineer. I work with everyone here at Intelitech. It is a fantastic job, and I love it. We are a .NET shop, and we're pretty much married to Microsoft. So .NET Aspire is super awesome if you work with a lot of Microsoft products. Before I go too much further, I also wanted to thank Dan for getting this relaunched. And I also wanted to do a quick shout out to Kevin Bost, who gave me the idea for .NET Aspire. A little bit of a preface is that I was working on a tech with him, VeloPack. Shout out to VeloPack as well. And he was using .NET Aspire to orchestrate some of the components for that. It was very, very, very cool. Sweet. All right, technical issues aside, what is .NET Aspire, right? So first of all, before we get any further, does anyone have any experience with .NET Aspire? And there's still some feedback. I'm going to assume no, right? So no one's really heard about it yet. You'll probably hear about it quite a bit as we go further into 2024. It's going to be Microsoft's new baby. I totally anticipate it. And .NET Aspire itself is a cloud-ready, observable, and opinionated stack for creating cloud-ready, used cloud-ready twice, but cloud-native distributed applications. So this is a component or a stack for orchestration, setting up all of your different services, how they interact with each other, and how you actually use them. So it's a really, really cool tool, and it kind of feels like you're bringing the cloud directly onto your local development environment while you're working on applications. So, and it's also specifically a developer tool. So there are some things for deployment to .NET Aspire. We'll get into that pretty briefly. It also assists with testing, but mostly just a development tool for orchestrating components, running distributed applications on your local machine. Have to stop to breathe. Any questions? Phil has a question? No, go for it.
When you say cloud native, given that this is .NET Aspire, is that Azure only?
So the question was, when I say cloud native, does that mean Azure only? And the answer to that is not necessarily. So you can hook it up with any cloud native service platform, so AWS or I guess like Google Cloud or Google whatever they have. So those will work for it, but you don't get some of the same integrations. Microsoft is going to go with all those Azure services first for specific, like Aspire integrations. So you may be at a disadvantage if you choose to use this for AWS or Google at the moment. As it gets a little bit more mature, I'm sure that they're going to bring in some more components. All right, sweet, next slide. So first, as you are going to, if you dive into Aspire, what you're probably going to hear the most is that it's opinionated. So every single presentation has a slide on opinionation in Aspire, and it's pretty vague, pretty loose. I don't know exactly what it means. So I tried to deduce it just a little bit myself. But really what it means for Aspire is that it is consistent. So I don't want to read directly off my slide, but I'm going to for this one because this is actually a little bit smaller text. But it is a consistent experience for each component of your distributed application that doesn't attempt to abstract the cloud necessarily. It integrates the cloud into your local development environment, right? So being consistent means that there's a sort of like a higher level abstraction for how we compose components of the cloud. But the abstraction kind of ends there. Those higher level abstractions actually run different container services. They actually run different projects of your .NET solution. They actually execute executables and things like that. It's not trying to mimic or imitate anything. What it's actually trying to do is bring all these services to you so you can begin using them. So being opinionated means that you are consistent, and anything that attempts to use your APIs is actually going to go through, anything that uses Aspire's APIs is actually going to have a similar way of how it's executing programs on your local development environment. It also makes some assumptions. That's another important piece about the opinionation of Aspire, and a consistent piece of it too. So it's always assuming that you're going to be using telemetry, right? And that's a safe assumption to make, and it's a very productive assumption, as you'll find when you start getting into it. All of the components of an Aspire app are probably going to be observable. Are definitely going to be observable. It's one of the most important pieces of Aspire. And, while I scroll and ship some things, I have some speaker notes. And the next piece of that is actually the cloud focus. So opinionated for Aspire means cloud focus. Opinionated for everybody else usually just means you have a focus that you really, really believe in. The cloud focus for Aspire is that it's built to create cloud applications and support cloud application development, agnostic to your client-side code, server-side code, what is or isn't a microservice. Everything's kind of treated the same, but it is all with the assumption that you're going to eventually deploy your application to the cloud as a distributed service, right? So with those two things in mind, I have to take my break to breathe and also have some water. Excuse me. So with those two things in mind, the focus isn't really on the business logic or the internal logic of your application. Aspire is bringing you composition, like I've said, to actually create something that's ready to deploy to Azure. It is, again, agnostic to what you're actually considering API, what you're actually considering client code, what you're using as your microservices. It's just trying to get you the most consistent, most ready for the cloud application that you can create. So let's continue. Any questions? Joe?
We had an online question.
Let's go for it.
Just asking what's an application?
So an application, so in the context of .NET Aspire, an application is going to be any distributed system. So an application could be a single piece of that distributed system. Let's say if you have a solution that has like 3 microservices. You have 3 technical applications in there, but in a greater sense, an application is also the distributed system itself. So the application in the greater sense in that example would just be all 3 of those systems as they work together. So that's the answer to that. Does that answer his question? Oh, excuse me, I also forgot to repeat the question. I wasn't looking at Dan. He actually has it on the screen, so I would do that. Anyway, sorry. The question there was, what is an application? All right. Let us continue. So it's probably helpful to kind of describe what is Aspire trying to solve, right? So have any of you ever worked on creating a distributed system? Or any full stack application engineers or anything like that in here? If you've worked on a full stack application, you've created a distributed system, a distributed application. Or if you've ever created a microservice for an API or something like that, you've worked on a distributed system. It's just an application where there's many different pieces that go into it that you invoke over REST, let's say HTTP REST, or if you use gRPC or something like that. So there are a lot of challenges associated with that. One of them is just configuring your components, right? Configuration in traditional cloud native applications is typically front-loaded. If you're going to start using a new piece, if you're going to introduce Redis to your, let's say, an API to reduce your database calls, Redis is a caching system, the amount of configuration that you actually have to do to get that working is, pretty good amount, right? You have to, I don't know a lot about Redis, so I probably chose the worst example for it. But let's talk about SQL Server. So let's say you're trying to get a SQL Server database into your application that's already using Redis for caching. Anyways, the amount of work that you have to go and do for that is a little bit more tremendous than you might even anticipate. You have to set up your local SQL Server. You have to actually set up the database. You have to set up your connection strings. And there's a lot of tools around that are helping us. Entity Framework is definitely one of them, but that never ever takes away from what is the actual configuration. And the big piece is just that adding new services to your distributed application becomes more and more difficult as all these pieces have to continue to talk to each other and communicate with each other. Because now the configuration is more than just a connection string or like how your SQL Server is configured itself to do some stuff. The configuration continuously just gets more and more difficult to actually understand.
Good question.
Yeah, go for it.
So how does this differ from like infrastructure as code tools? Where
So
you seem to be doing something similar. Does this kind of simplify where you don't have to know every little details like I want a SQL server?
yeah, so the question was, how does this differ from infrastructure as code? The answer is that Aspire is almost, I would say that it's 100% geared only towards local development, right? So infrastructure as code is really great if you want to get a replicable system, if you want to maybe have a little bit more of a vetting system for getting out infrastructure changes to the actual, like service provider. Aspire doesn't really do that. Aspire is more just for how am I going to actually test and ensure that all of my system is working together so that my infrastructure as code is actually providing a system that works when I deploy this out, right? So they go well together. But the distinction there is just like, this is specifically for development. Infrastructure as code is more for production use, right?
Do they have helpers for getting from one to the other?
For
So it's like, having your Terraform set up based on, some configuration on your Aspire application or something.
Yeah, so the question was, do they have helpers for getting from one place to another, for getting from infrastructure as code, such as Terraform, to like Azure or the other way around, or sorry, Azure. I'm going to call this Azure a lot. I was like rehearsing and I kept on doing that. But from getting from like a Terraform or Azure services into Aspire, or from getting Aspire into Terraform or Azure. The answer really is that there isn't tooling necessarily, but you can publish a manifest of your Aspire application that describes how different services, or like what are the different services that are inside of the application itself, and what are some of the, what are some of the names of the projects and things like that. So it describes how you connect the pieces, and Aspire can publish that, but it can't really take in an external description of your service or your infrastructure and then transpile that into actual code, right? So the answer to that, I guess, is that Aspire can help you build a Terraform script if you publish the manifest, but going from Terraform to Aspire is impossible because you need the business logic component that composes the system itself.
So basically, from Aspire to Terraform, potentially you could use a manifest to write a script that would be your Terraform.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. It's one of the things that I kind of wanted to touch on, but I didn't. Yeah, I don't have enough confidence in myself. Anyways, excuse me. So, any more questions? All right, I'll move on to the next part. So, the next piece of traditional cloud native development is service discovery or discovery. This is probably one of the things that has pained me the most as a developer, trying to work with distributed applications, things that try to communicate with each other. And all of that configuration, unless if you start using shims or some sort of abstraction layer that you then have to maintain and take time to maintain, and there's no consistent standardized practice for such a thing, which is why Opinionation is actually pretty awesome, is difficult. It's very difficult to understand in a traditional cloud native development environment. What is what? What is localhost port 5081? What is localhost port 5082, right? I'm trying to communicate with these services in my development environment, but none of their names actually describe what they are. Very, very difficult to work with, and it adds mental overhead. If I want to know what service I'm trying to communicate with, I have the memory of a goldfish. About 5 seconds is all it takes for me to forget what that localhost port was actually pointing to. Same with connection strings. Unless if they're very descriptive connection strings, they can kind of get, they can get in the way of me understanding what my application is trying to do and what services are trying to communicate with each other. So discovery is one of the pain points of a traditional cloud native development environment. And then finally, we reach observability. This is probably one of the most important pieces of creating a distributed application. And traditional cloud native development environments don't really have great discovery they don't have great discovery mechanisms, but I went over that just a minute ago. They don't have great observability mechanisms built into them, right? So a lot of the observability component that you're going to get from actually doing cloud native development in the traditional way without .NET Aspire has to be either you abstract it away into configurations that you then have to share between each and every one of your services, and then that becomes a pain to maintain, or you do them uniquely for each and every one of your services, and then you have something that you're repeating several times, just trying to get the same telemetry service to communicate with each one of your pieces of your distributed application. So observability, making sure that you have logging, that you have metrics, and that you have tracing can become a pain for some of these traditional systems because it can be such a disjointed, disconnected experience. And, trying to integrate that, or trying to integrate new systems with the same observability as your previous systems can also be a huge pain, right? So it really reduces how quickly you can move when you're having to re-tinker with your telemetry and your tracing every single time you add a new service to your distributed application. So with that, any questions? I'll take that as a no. Next slide. And so enter Aspire. So this is where we get into the meat of it. What does Aspire actually do for us, right? We're talking about distributed applications, and it seems like it's just so far away. What does that even mean? But Aspire provides us with things that help really aid the process of creating distributed applications in our development environment. One of those things is its powerful defaults. It has some incredible defaults. And again, we reach the opinionation part, right? These defaults, Microsoft just kind of anticipates that you're going to use them for every application that you create. And it's a great assumption to make. It's a great opinion to have that you're going to be using some of these defaults. It gets you things like service discovery, right? It integrates service discovery directly into service defaults that you can actually inject into all of your dependency injection containers as you're working with your other services. I'm going to take a break to drink, if anyone has any questions. All right. But it gets you service discovery, which is a way for our disparate services to identify and communicate with each other that is immediately readable and understandable to a human writing the code and reading and trying to grok what it actually does. It gets you resiliency for free. You just get this out of the box. So for your HTTP and REST clients, and that's one unit, HTTP REST clients, you get, excuse me. Okay, I thought I saw a hand. For your HTTP REST clients, you actually get default poly retry policies. So you have exponential backoff for your retries. That's an opinion that Aspire makes, and Microsoft believes it's the right thing to do. And I also believe it's the right thing to do. If you don't have retry policies for your HTTP clients, you're probably doing something wrong. Also, an incredibly difficult thing to find if you're just a new developer entering into the world of distributed services. Because no one needs to tell you, like HTTP requests should just work, right? I don't know. I don't need to tell it to retry. But Aspire gives it to you for free. You don't even really need to know about them at that point, and somehow they're still working for you. It gives us health checks. Anything that provides web endpoints, an ASP.NET application, is going to get free health check endpoints mapped to it. So health checks are just important in any system. You should probably have them, especially if you're going to be making anything that someone actually touches, because when it stops working, people often blame themselves when they shouldn't. So make sure you have health checks. And then finally, it just gives us telemetry for free using OpenTelemetry protocol. That is really awesome. Like, just knowing that it gets you OpenTelemetry, you guys should all just be switching over to Aspire right now. Like, no one's calling their boss. I'm a little bit concerned. But having telemetry built into your application, something that you don't really need to actually concern yourself when you start creating your other pieces of your distributed system, is big. It's very, very important. And having that by default also encourages other users to have, or other people who are consuming Aspire to actually use telemetry in their applications. We have a little bit more of a system that is easier to explore and easier to understand as it's actually being used. So the next piece of Aspire really is the composition and discovery component. Aspire is all about composing applications. So composing new resources and services using Aspire is as easy pretty often as just including a new NuGet package. One of the easiest experiences of my life was actually adding Redis to something, and obviously I don't know anything about Redis, I just was explaining that. But 30 minutes, I had caching ready for one of my applications using .NET Aspire, zero knowledge of Redis. Very, very cool. So, service discovery is also something that you get for free, right? Aspire will add service discovery, and it also acts as sort of a routing mechanism, so that if you use strong names, if you use, let's say, like key values in your actual Aspire application, now service discovery becomes as easy as actually hooking up those keys that you assigned in the startup project, the apt host for Aspire, and then using those in place of, let's say, like base addresses for HTTP clients, or connection strings for databases or Redis, or pretty much anything else that takes in a connection string. So, or a URI. Those are those are like huge. Like actually understanding what an application is communicating with before I even start looking into the configuration component of it at all. So, finally, what Aspire gets us is a built-in dashboard for our development environment. So as we're actually building out our application, adding all these distributed components, all these different services, we have a way to actually start up the application, start up all of those resources all at once, and a way to monitor and sort of like user test them ourselves. In our development environment, we can actually rely on Aspire to start up those services, and then we can just click on them and we go to them. Pretty cool. Aspire's dashboard also comes in with metrics, investigation, things like that. You can actually start looking at the logging. You can actually start looking at tracing, and it gives you a nice Gantt chart showing you the end-to-end trace of an HTTP request or anything like that. You get that for free. I don't know how it even works. I was very impressed by it, but you get that for free. You get your observability just right out of the box. All right, any questions so far? Reese?
What's an example of an Aspire primitive?
Oh yeah, so the primitives, I'm actually gonna go right into this. Would you mind wait, oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, the question was, what's an example of the of an Aspire primitive? Hopefully Aspire doesn't expire anyways. But, and the answer is let's wait until the next slide. So I am going to go. Anyone else have any questions? All right, let's go. Aspire app host resources. So these are actually the primitive types that you end up using with Aspire. So two big things here. Aspire app host resources are, like I said, sort of the main primitives that we're using to interact with Aspire and actually register and host some of these applications, some of these components of our distributed system, right? So each of these services. They can be a lot of different things, right? But at their core, they're executables. So Node.js is an example of one. If you guys have ever worked on a full stack application with Vue, you might be used to doing some MS build magic that you have to be like really, really smart to have actually even like seen or like understood how it works with an SPA app and stuff like. Anyways, I'm about to go into like a whole thing because of having to do that myself one time. But Node.js becomes as easy as just including a .use node or a use npm in your app host project, right? Executables are one of the primitive types. So that means we can actually run executables. The other piece, as I was getting at, there's kind of two big pieces. The other piece is that not only are other people able to create and package and distribute commonly used developer tools like npm, you can also create them yourself. If you have an executable that your environment relies upon or your distributed application relies upon, you can actually use Aspire, the API for services, to create that and run it, basically, right? So it's really important for you to, or it's a really, really cool piece if you have any reliance on anything that's executable, container, or project. Anyways, let's continue with more of those primitive types. Oh, excuse me. And the next another primitive type. There's several, but I think I covered the main ones here. There's containers. So we can also use .NET Aspire to stand up and create new containers for things like Postgres, Redis, SQL Server, storage containers for Azure. And that's a way for us to actually get some of those cloud features onto our development environment, running on our machine using images and a container service like Docker or Podman, I think is the other one. Another type of primitive is parameters. And parameters are things that we can actually use to have some amount of agency over what makes it into the configuration for containers and executables, because these are low configuration options. Sometimes we actually want to override some of the parameters supplied. If I get into my demo, I will show you how those work a little bit. And parameters also provide a context to the application itself. So if you create a container for Postgres, for example, you might want to set up a username, or you might want to set up a password, but you want it to be set up in a deterministic way. Parameters are the way to get that. And then finally, there's projects, probably the most important one, because we're all making C# applications here. You can ignore all of the other ones if your distributed application is just 3 projects that you've created yourself, right? So projects are ways that we can actually run, start, and configure our actual .NET executable applications as we've created them in our solution. So ASP.NET Web Apps are probably the big one. And then I decided to be a little bit redundant and also say any .NET app. But ASP.NET is kind of like the main thing.
So the database would always be in containers of some sort?
So the question was, so the database would always be in containers of some sort? Not necessarily. So you can choose if you want to use a configuration being supplied for something else, or if you want to actually configure a container for Postgres or, let's say, SQL Server. So I would recommend that you do use a container because it's replicable. It's going to be a little bit more, it's going to be a little bit more of a clean state. If you go into it, there's no chance of you dirtying up your database. But just don't use Aspire if you want to not, get the container for the actual database.
So if I wanted to connect directly to Cosmos or something like that, I use a parameter to do that, there'd be no container.
The question there was if I wanted to connect directly to Cosmos, I'm assuming on your actual PC, right, running an instance?
Yeah, or the project, I guess I'm trying to envision how you'd not have a container, I guess, is really the...
Yeah, so for Aspire, I would say the best way to just not have a containerized solution is to not use Aspire to actually configure the application, and just go with a more traditional way of setting up the connection string in your actual development environment for that project specifically. I don't know if I think I repeated the question. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so that would be my recommendation if you wanted to go that way. If you wanted to do it the Aspire way, it's mainly focused on getting things replicable and mimicking the cloud environment. And in the cloud environment, because the main focus here is just like on specifically Azure container apps or containerized applications, they don't really have that state of I can grab things from the like the host service sort of thing, like the host computer. However, there's probably nothing wrong with it if you try to do that. So if your use case is to actually use a service that already exists on your computer and you don't want to have that replicable, then yeah, I would say just go with the traditional configuration options and skip over the Aspire stuff. But also I recommend against that. And also I have to say that because I'm doing the Aspire presentation. Any other questions?
So what's the scope that it's running in? So is it like within a solution, or like I've got 3 separate solutions with discrete applications, but there is some communication between them, and it'd be nice to be able to stand them all up at once and say, okay, I want to test everyone talking to each other.
I see. So the question was, what is the scope of what I'm going to call it the app host can actually ingest and actually start it, right? And see them communicating with each other. And I didn't really test this, but it's a really great question because if we're working with multiple repos, if we're that's a really good way to actually do it, right? I would say that Aspire is a little less fit for that, unless if you go with an option where you actually containerize those solutions yourself, and then use those containers that you've created, maybe in an image, and then you plug them into Aspire directly. That would be one solution. Another solution, we're using the word solution a lot. I'm using the word solution a lot. But another solution may be to actually create one larger solution that's going to compose all of those different things. I've seen some word that Microsoft's been working on solution files to make things like that a little bit easier too. So either connecting up your solutions, which may not be desirable, or exporting some of the components that you're creating in other projects as their own total component would be my way of sort of like solving that, I suppose. Does that answer your question? Sweet. So, any more questions? All right, we'll go to the next slide. The biggest thing that I think you can get from .NET Aspire, excuse me?
We had an online question asking if Python apps are supported.
Are Python apps supported by .NET Aspire? The answer is yes. Yeah, so if you can compile, you can just run Python as an executable, and that kind of falls under the executable primitive that I touched on, right? So you can run your Python targeting a script specifically and actually run it that way. Is that worth the effort? That would be the question. Maybe. Can you compile Python into an executable file?
Yes.
That would be easier. So compiling your Python into an executable Python, file, I guess, would be kind of the way to do that, and then use Aspire executables to actually run that. Or make it into a container. Yeah, exactly. Make it into an image. Any other questions? Sweet. All right, so one of the biggest things about .NET Aspire 2, and I'm running out of time, sorry about this, is that we can actually start piecemealing it into our application. There is nothing telling us that we have to use Aspire to start up all of our resources and make them work. I definitely think it would behoove you to actually do so, because trying to get those things started up and actually configured to work with Aspire components that are being managed by the Aspire app host would be difficult. But so long as you actually include the projects, include some of the services, all the services that you end up communicating with inside of your app host container or your app host project, so that Aspire can actually execute them and start running them, you can piecemeal the connectivity portions yourself. You don't have to actually put those all in and use Aspire's discovery. You don't have to use its observability, and you don't need to use any of its other pieces that make your life easier. So not starting from scratch is definitely a way that we can actually begin to integrate Aspire into existing applications that will benefit from it down the line, because they are so, well, because it aids in the process of actually creating new applications or creating new services for distributed applications. So Dan, I'm going to ask you a question. Do we have time to demonstrate?
Yes. The timer is just the slides, so you have time.
Oh, sweet. All right, so who's interested? Oh, sorry, questions? Yeah.
So if I was going to go create a new Aspire project, is that like a project template in Visual Studio that you like say create a file name or whatever, and then does it have like an output of an executable or DLL or what kind of?
So, the question was, can I create a new Aspire project just from a template through Visual Studio? And then what is the actual output of that project? So the actual output, that's something I totally glossed over. I'm guessing that it's actually just an executable that's composing the application itself. So you run this executable, and it's kind of maintaining the state of each one of the executables or containers that it's created. So I'm guessing it's just an executable application. I know for a fact it's not a library, because you can run it. But the answer to, is it just a template that I can create? And the answer to that is yes. You can start from scratch, and kind of opposed to what that slide said, but you can just totally start from scratch, create a new, let's say like zero project Aspire application, and then begin integrating more and more application and pieces into the Aspire application itself. Aspire by itself only requires 2 projects, and I'll show you how to actually add those in just a moment. But it requires a project defaults, and it requires an app host. And if you really wanted to, I think you can even get rid of the project defaults, but you probably shouldn't. So, does that answer your question, Reese? Sweet. Any other questions?
We had an online question that was The question is ACA versus AKS deployment for Aspire, question mark? And then how to deploy the app host with a container over AKS.
Okay, so the question was how to deploy the Aspire application as a container over Azure Container Services or Kubernetes, right? Container apps. So I actually have a slide for that we'll get to. Right now, what you can do for actually publishing and distributing, deploying your container applications is you can upload them directly to Azure Container Services. I am not going to show you how to do that, unfortunately. It's not something that I actually got around to. It's just something that I know you can do. You use, I think it's AZD. I'm not super familiar with the Azure side of things. Phil might be better about this. But Azure has its own command line tooling that you can use to actually deploy these applications directly. And then support for Kubernetes and stuff like that is coming, I believe. There's some documentation out there. I might link it, but it's not something I'm super knowledgeable on, unfortunately. I was more, into the development part of the stuff. I never expect any of my applications to actually make it into the hands of anybody, so, which is probably a bad trait. All right, so we'll get into a demonstration if there's no more questions. Sweet. All right, so I'm going to switch things up just a little bit. Let me see if I can make this work. I also have a piece of paper. So there's a lot that goes into this. Hopefully we'll have time to go over it all. I'm going to hit duplicate. All right. Can everyone see this? I'm assuming so because I can see it and we're all seeing the same thing. So, yeah, I don't know how I got hired. What was that? Yes. Yeah, so I unfortunately don't know how to actually zoom in on things like the Solution Explorer, but I can totally zoom in on the code editor as we get into it. So what I wanted to show you guys is how we actually add Aspire to an existing distributed application. So first of all, let me give you a very quick rundown of how this distributed application is communicating with itself and how it's actually working, right? So I called it concurrency. It's a little bit of a portmanteau between convert and currency. And the funny thing about it is that I only added converting currency yesterday because I thought it was kind of boring. So convert currency. We have an API portion that is communicating with a database. We're using Postgres Entity Framework for the database. The data project is just a simple class library containing our models, DTOs, migrations, some validation components that I ended up kind of not really using that much. Then we have an exchange service, which is an example of a microservice that you may be creating for other things. This is a little bit of a joke because let's take a look at what this actually does. Oh, sorry. Fix your client, and I will zoom in now so you can actually take a look at stuff. And also, I have an ultra-wide screen monitor. Never, ever, ever use an ultra-wide screen monitor for programming because this ends up happening. You guys cannot see what I was seeing on my ultra-wide. So, but basically, this is just communicating with an external service, REST-based HTTP API, to get exchange rates and currency symbols. So my application called concurrency isn't even converting currency by itself. But that's okay, because it's a good example. And then we have a Blazor server website that our clients can actually visit and use. And I'm not going to show that it's actually working. You guys should just trust me. But I will show you how to add .NET Aspire and get it working that way. So if we want to actually come into here and add Aspire to an application, what we're going to do is, and I should preface this, if you're planning on using this soon, you're going to want to use Visual Studio Preview. Aspire is not yet out in general availability, so all of this stuff is preview. So with that being said, I hope I didn't just crush anybody's hopes for Aspire. So with that being said, though, we can actually add Aspire incredibly easily in Visual Studio Preview. I'm hovering over it right now. Add .NET Aspire Orchestrator support. And this is just any piece of our application. It asks us, what should we name the project prefix? Where are we going to put it? And then it's also going to tell us what different projects are going to be created. And we can just add it. So, pretty fun foot gun. If you use the right way of doing things and you manage your package versions centrally, it kind of breaks adding orchestration support. So what you want to do is take these package references and stuff and remove the version from them. And the same with the service defaults. This one has a lot more. We're just going to remove these versions so that it works with manage package versions centrally. This is super fun. You're just going to watch me like backspace a few times, and time's going to run out. All right, sweet. So we remove those. I actually have a little bit of a cheat code here. I have my copy board, and I'm going to go into packages and add those. So Aspire is great, but I don't know if they really expected this to be used for production-ready services quite yet, so they didn't add any support for the directory packages props. All right. So after you fix up your actual dependencies, you can save everything. And when we actually right-clicked and added the orchestration support, what we did is we created two projects, right? We have an app host, and we have the service defaults. The app host itself is actually the orchestrator. It's what's taking in all of our different services and registering them as projects. And then when we run the app host, it's actually going to run all of the different services or the dependencies that we've specified. So far I've added the concurrency site to it. But as I told you, there's a few more pieces of our distributed application that I'm going to want to add. And one of them was the Exchange Service microservice. And in order to add that, we can just go and say add .NET Aspire Orchestrator support. And it detects that we're already using .NET Aspire Orchestrator. And it asks if we just want to add it directly to orchestration, which we do. And it adds it right there. And finally, there's one more little piece, probably the most important piece, and that's the actual API for our client. So we'll go ahead and add that one too. All right. So before we get any further, I actually want to just reference these. So we're going to set these to variables. And that is the site. It's not wise to actually do your site before you do all the dependencies. The site's dependencies. API equals. Also, sorry if my coding stuff is really atrocious. I don't actually know how to code. I just come in here and I act. And then we'll just call that a service. All right, sweet. These are all technically services, but I was only descriptive with a couple of these variable names. So when we actually start this application, all I've actually done here is I've added references to the orchestrator to say that these are the projects that I'm going to want to run. I haven't done anything to do with discovery or configuration yet. All I've done is add projects. And you can see that my startup project has changed to concurrency.apphost, which is this project right here. And if I run this, let's see what happens. The rain's really coming down. Oh yeah, it takes a minute. I should say that. It likes to run the clock. There we go.
So this would not be something I want to run on my early Windows 10 computer.
Maybe not. Yeah. The question was, this is not something that you'd want to run in your early Windows 10 computer. No, this is exclusively only for like Alienware, super uber computers. So, as you can see, we've entered into the Aspire dashboard. This has taken all the 3 pieces of my distributed application, and it's kind of unified them into a single piece that I can observe, that I can take a look at, that I can see the health, the state of. It also gives us some of those observability components that I was talking about, right? We get a console for all of the different pieces of my distributed application. I haven't changed the configuration for any of these. I haven't changed the service discovery for any of these. All I've changed is that I've added .NET Spire orchestration. We also get structured logging. And it's already using the logging from our application, well, that it didn't really have. There's no logging in the application before, but now it's actually registered some loggers. And it is showing me the output in a structured format of all of the logs from my application. I've done nothing. There was no tricks here. All I did was add orchestration. It added a few more components that I actually told you about, that I actually forgot to mention a little bit, maybe. But the few components that I actually added were pretty small, right? It adds service defaults, which we get from the service default package, which I'll show you in just a minute. And for anything that's using a web application host, it also adds map default endpoints. So that's how we're getting some of these extra components. That's how we're getting the logging that's going directly through into the telemetry service, I guess, the actual structured logs, traces, and metrics. So we can actually see traces, but there's nothing, and then metrics for each one of our resources. These are the 3 pillars of observability, right? We have metrics, we have tracing, and we have logging. And Aspire is basically just kind of giving it to us. So this is some of the stuff about metrics. Someone who's smarter than me probably knows a lot about this. I don't even know what half this actually does. GC, the object.size, I don't know. The GC stands for garbage collection. GIT stands for just in time. But those may be meaningful, or you may actually be able to detect or find areas of your application that need improvement just by using these metrics. So, super nifty, super useful. The one thing I haven't shown you guys is that the application is actually running. So these running things aren't lying to me. I can actually go to the site and show you what's going on. And the actual application is super simple. I had to pull it back a few times, but the idea of it is that you have a list of products, price, and then the currency, and you can convert between the currency, right? So if I want to show this in, let's say I think it's Iranian rial. I can refresh that. It's actually $56,296,000 or $100,000, right? Lots of money. And we also can get our Swagger pages from the same exact place. We can get the Swagger. We can get the Swagger documentation also for the API here. So we have our microservice, and we also have our API. All of those things just composed together. All I did was right-click and left-click 3 or 4 times. And suddenly my entire application starts up at one click of the button instead of having to configure multiple startup projects. So that is how you add Aspire to an existing application. I see we're running out of time. I have way more that I wanted to show, but we might not get to it, unless if everybody wants to have a late night session. There's one more thing that I really wanted to show that speaks volumes to how well Aspire can actually contribute to the development process, in my opinion. And first, does anyone have any questions at this point? I'll take it as a no. So I was talking about service discovery. I was talking about how you can use named projects as the identifiers for communicating with those projects in your code. And here's how you actually do that, right? So we have a service, we have an API, and we have the site. Microservice would be a better way of doing it. The way to actually reveal some of these components, so you still have encapsulation, you still have separation of concerns. The way that you actually reveal these components to something like the client, the website, is that you can do with reference. If you spell it right, it works. With reference, with the actual website itself. So this is the project, we're adding it to the Aspire builder, and we can just start feeding these in. Let's say service. We can do another reference. Oops. Oh, there we go. So we've added these 2 projects as a reference to our actual site. let's take a quick look, a little bit of a detour, and look at some of the service default extensions that we're getting. When I was talking about defaults in the slides, this is what I was talking about. Configure OpenTelemetry. And remember that these add service defaults, each one of the projects was getting a reference to this and actually invoking this add service defaults on the host application builder. Excuse me. Throat's super dry today. The service defaults that I was talking about in the slides are directly, like in here as well. So we configure OpenTelemetry as a piece of that, which is right here too. Tells you a little bit how the telemetry is configured. We add default health checks, which is also an extension method in here that just adds checks for status of web services. We add service discovery to our services container, and then we configure HTTP client defaults. HTTP client defaults are things that are going to affect every single HTTP client that we stand up for our REST HTTP-based communication with external APIs. We add the standard resilience handler and the service discovery to the actual HTTP client. So that's where those things are coming from. If we actually go into the site itself, and let's take a look at the app settings.development.json, because I really don't like this. When I look at this, I don't like it. I don't really like looking at these because they are confusing to me. I don't know what those numbers mean, so I want to destroy them, get them out of here, right? So theoretically at this point, we've just crippled our application. When it attempts to get a connection string from the configuration, it's going to say a base address from the configuration. It's just going to go like, yeah, there's nothing there. It's going to throw a new invalid operation exception. So what if we could just do something like this, a little bit more of a descriptive name, right? I think this first one was the API. I probably shouldn't have included the string identifiers there. What if we could just do that, right? Will our application work is the question, right? We can also do the same thing for this one. And we can take this concurrency exchange service. And at this point, our application won't work because I forgot semicolons. And at this point, our application will now start working, but will it actually communicate on the website with these different services, right? These distributed applications. I'm 20 seconds over. There's just so much to talk about with Aspire. I'm going to show you that this works, and then I'm going to immediately end the presentation. No, I'm not going to end the presentation, but I'm going to actually finish up the slides. And you'll have to trust me that you can also you get login for free. That's included in the service defaults. We can add containers like the Postgres database, and we can also add other containers like Redis and implement caching to improve our applications that already exist, right? And just by demonstrating that I opened this is the actual site that was using those HTTP clients. I opened it, and it actually got some data. And I haven't included Redis or any actual data storage component to this, except for the database. So the service working is pretty telling. And also, it's getting these symbols, which are different monetary or currency symbols, right?
PHP is a monetary symbol. I don't know for what.
Honestly, yeah, I was thinking about the best way to do this, and I'm like, let's see if PHP. Yep, PHP. Probably Philippine something. PHP is on here. So that's 77,373 PHPs. That's one Azure Aspire. Azure Aspire's worth that much. But yeah, so that's what you can get out of the client discovery. Unfortunately, I don't have much more time for a demonstration, so I'm going to take us back to the slides. And you guys are going to get a little bit of a look. Let's see. Hopefully this works. Oh, I didn't like it. I use Canva for presentations, so a little bit of a scene behind the curtain there. So there's the demonstration. Sorry, I couldn't get through all of it. I knew that I was talking about too much. No one stopped me, though. So here's a little bit about the future of .NET Aspire. currently you can deploy directly to Azure, like I was talking about. Using the Azure CLI, you can deploy your Aspire applications directly to Azure. Supposedly they work. I haven't had time to test this, unfortunately, but I do trust that they do work. You can also publish manifests, like I talked about, where it describes your application and the different components of your service for your own CI/CD pipelines. Deployments to additional environments. So K8s was like one of the big ones for this, right? Are slated for the future. I'm not entirely sure what the status is right now. They might be too experimental for them to really be considering, but deploying to like a server and stuff like that is going to be coming in the future, most likely. General availability, spring 2024. And anyone who's like really, let's say like aware of what time it is, will say that it is right now, spring of 2024.
By the end of June.
That's what, yeah.
That's what they're saying.
That's what we're hoping for, right?
That's the idea.
Yeah. I will say one thing. Microsoft Build conference is coming up pretty soon. So that's going to be like May 21st to May 23rd. I don't have a really good memory. I have it written down right here. Microsoft likes to announce things entering general availability at their conferences. So pay attention to that. And I would seriously encourage everybody to explore that, look into it, and actually sign up for the Build conference. It is free to join online. I actually signed up for it like earlier today. So that's pretty much it. Questions? Information right here. You can see the GitHub. I'll make sure to, I think, yeah, Dan already has these slides, so he can save those and distribute them as he'd like, or he can get in touch with me. My email's right there, professional email. Professional emails only. Don't sign me up for anything, please. But yeah, any questions about Aspire?
So when you change the URL to just use the friendly names, does that mean you have to deploy using their tools? Because it seems like that would break any other way of deploying.
That is something important to note. So does it, oh, excuse me. Sorry, repeat the question. So the question was, if you use those friendly names, will that break all other areas of deployment? The answer is a little bit more complicated than you might think, because it's actually using a configuration for HTTP clients, which is adding service discovery. So you can technically get this for free in another application if you were to set all that up yourself. You'd have to go through creating those abstractions and everything like that, and then actually linking them to a behavior that starts up your application, which is why I would recommend against it. But you can do that in a primitive way using add service discovery on your HTTP client. And doing it in that way will actually supply the configuration using a more friendly name. Does that answer your question? Yeah. So yeah, you can still supply the configuration as long as you're using add service discovery in your HTTP default configuration call. Reese?
Does that mean that if you're not a non-Aspire project, you can still add that service or configuration?
The question was, does that mean if you are using a non-Aspire project, can you still use the service discovery for HTTP clients? And the answer is, I'm going to say yes, but I'm also going to encourage no, because I want you to use Aspire. No. Yes, you totally can. It's one of those things where it's like, what is it worth? Because at the end of the day, you still have to configure those components yourself, right? And you have to supply those through environment variables or something like that down the line, no matter what. So naturally, the best option is to connect it with Aspire because it's providing functionality, and getting a name out of it is kind of secondary, right? So you're starting up the project using Aspire, and providing that name is giving you value in that you as a developer are understanding where this is configured. However, if you start using this in everywhere, although it would be helpful, the configuration options and other such things are still kind of hidden from you because there's maybe not a single area where those names are coming from. So, yeah, that's more of an opinion though. Definitely an opinion. The answer to the question is definitely yes. You can use the service discovery with HTTP client configurations. Any other questions?